Instead, Albert fled to his brother's house.
He says, I'm going to be arrested. I says, well, what? What did you do? And he says, I've done some things. I says, what did you do? And he just started to cry.
It was then that Albert made a startling confession to his sister-in-law about a break-in gone bad.
He says, I did harm to somebody. I says, what are you talking about? He says, I'm responsible for the old woman dying. I said, what old woman? What are you talking about? He says, I broke in a house, he says, and I scared the woman. She died of a heart attack.
The woman Albert was referring to was 85-year-old Mary Mullen. She had indeed been found dead of a heart attack in her home, but there had been no evidence of foul play, and Mullen's death was never considered a homicide. Now, Albert brought his brother Richard and Richard's family home with him. When they arrived at Albert's house, the police were already there waiting.
Something's going down. I says, you know, how come everybody's all of a sudden look at your car? So he says, well, I think this is it. I think they're going to arrest me. Then he started picking up speed.
He ended up driving on the wrong side of the street, half on the street, half on the sidewalk. He was hitting no parking signs, stuff like that there.
My husband says, you know, you can't do this. Cops are everywhere. So that's when he pulled over.
He says, you stay here, and he got out and he started running.
The chase continued on foot, but Albert's politeness kicked in. When one of the cops dropped his gun, Albert stopped running, found it, and handed it back to the officer. The cop showed his appreciation by cuffing him. When questioned by police, Albert confessed to several of the Green Man rapes. The judge in the case found the confessions disturbing enough that he sent Albert to a mental hospital for observation. There, Albert would meet another mental patient named George Nasser. As usual, Albert could not help bragging about his exploits.
He was constantly talking about what his crimes were.
While talking to George Nasser, Albert would confess for the first time that he was the Boston Strangler. Albert DeSalvo began the fall of 1964 at the Bridgewater State Hospital for the criminally insane. He had been arrested for a series of rapes in Cambridge called the Green Man crimes. The judge had sent him to the hospital to determine if Albert was competent to stand trial. As far as the psychiatrists were concerned, he was.
I diagnosed Albert as a sociopath. A major characteristic was he was manipulative, not above committing crimes to get what he wanted. But there were also aspects, he was terribly insecure. He wanted to be the most important person in the world.
Declared competent, Albert was sent back to jail, but not for long. In jail, Albert announced he was having visions of his wife appearing and berating him for his crimes. So the judge promptly sent Albert back to the mental hospital. This time, the psychiatrists decided to label him incompetent. Then suddenly, Albert started talking like he never had before.
He bragged so much nobody believed him. As a matter of fact, he was found out only because he bragged to a cellmate, George Nasser, who was very bright.
Nasser, who was in the mental hospital awaiting trial for murder, became Albert's confidant.
He just wanted to know, what could a person do to help himself and his family if he had a series of terrible crimes to confess to and didn't want to be simply buried in the system, but wanted treatment for his crimes and wanted help for his family.
According to Nasser, the terrible crimes Albert was hinting at were the Boston stranglings. Nasser told Albert he would mention the problem to his own attorney, the famous young defense lawyer, F. Lee Bailey. Bailey was intrigued by Albert's veiled admissions, but jailhouse confessions to unsolved crimes are quite common and often invented. So Bailey wanted some proof that Albert was telling the truth.
To see if DeSalvo knew what only the killer could know, and no one could memorize if the real killer had told him.
Bailey went to the Boston police and asked for detailed questions on the stranglings, questions he could use to quiz Albert.
We gave him probably 25 questions that, as far as we knew, were pretty much secreted in our organization. They certainly were never printed in the newspapers or was on television.
When Bailey arrived at the mental hospital with the list of strangler questions for Albert, George Nasser was present as the meeting started.
Bailey then pulled open a folder and asked Al a question. It was something like, what was under the sofa of Mrs. So-and-so's apartment. And Al said something like it was a pink and blue scarf, silk scarf. And that's when I said, I'll say, Al, I'm leaving.
Bailey checked Albert's answers with the Boston police, who told him Albert had passed the test with flying colors. Now Bailey was sure he was dealing with the real Boston Strangler. He called Albert's wife Irmgard and told her. Irmgard packed up their belongings and left with the children. Albert never saw his family again. But when his brother Richard came to visit him, Albert told Richard he had great plans for the future.
The way he explained it was he was going to admit to something. It was going to make him famous and rich. He would be able to have books and movies and so many different things, and there'd be so much money involved that he would even own the hospital, the mental hospital that he'd be in.
F. Lee Bailey signed on as Albert's lawyer. His top priority from that point on was to keep his client out of the electric chair. So Bailey cut a deal with the authorities. Albert would confess only if the court ruled him insane from the very start. But word was getting around that someone was confessing to the Boston Stranglings. State Attorney General Edward Brooke decided to take control.
I filed a petition in the Supreme Judicial Court asking for a restraining order against F. Lee Bailey.
Brooke had the court appoint Albert a legal guardian. Bailey was allowed to stay on as Albert's attorney, and the state agreed that in exchange for the confessions, Albert's words could not be used against him.
All his admissions were given under guardianship. Therefore, they were absolutely inadmissible in a criminal case without a waiver on his part.
The police planned to corroborate the confessions with physical evidence and then prosecute Albert. The interrogation of Albert DeSalvo was now ready to begin. Albert described the murder of Nina Nichols, victim number 2, as he pointed to a diagram of her apartment.
I was right here.
And you grabbed it.
Grabbed it right here.
Right, and fell back on the bed.
When she fell back, right?
Yes.
I was in this position here. Right here. Like, and my feet went right around her and crossed over this way here.
Close around her waist?
No, it brought her legs.
Right. You really had her pinned then.
I don't even like to talk about this.
Then Albert claimed his sexual urges overwhelmed him.
As soon as I saw the back of her head, right? Not her face. Didn't see nothing but the back of her head, right? Just everything built up inside me. Before you know it, I put my arm around her and that was it.
To lure his youngest strangling victim, Mary Sullivan, Albert explained that he used his green man ploy.
I had told her I'd come up there to do some work in the apartment. And she said, well, I didn't know nothing about it. But anyhow, she invited me in. I went in with her, and that's where I put the knife to her. And told her, don't scream. I won't hurt you. She was still alive when I had intercourse with her. She allowed me to do it to her. You understand me? After I had taken her clothes off, right? I said, now I'm going to tie you up. I'm going to leave. And I straddled her. So that her hands, I was sitting on them, really. Because she was really fighting viciously, trying to get up, for life. And I had got on top of her so that she could not be in any position to, reach up and scratch me. Strangle it.
The next grim detail Albert described was one that only Sullivan's killer could have known.
There's something I did with her.
What did you do with her?
I know I left the broom inside her, but I didn't insert it to hurt her and penetrate her. You understand me?
In all, Albert claimed he killed 13 women, 2 more than the police suspected. But after hours of talking with him, all the authorities had was talk. They couldn't link any physical evidence to Albert. That was not for lack of trying. There were no witnesses. Fingerprints from the scenes did not match Albert. Nothing connected him to the crimes except his word.
He knew a lot of details that had not been in print. So we felt that if he were not the Boston Strangler, he either knew the Strangler or had been with the Strangler.
The people of Boston wanted to believe that the Strangler had been discovered at last, but there were skeptics. The Strangler story had been front-page news for nearly 2 solid years. Albert could surely have studied the crimes from the news coverage.
It is very interesting to me that Albert's confession reproduces the misinformation that appeared in the newspapers. For example, he grossly mistook the time of day that one of the murders was committed. He was mistaken about the type of weapon in another case.
The police had agreed not to use DeSalvo's confessions as evidence against him, and they'd been unable to corroborate Albert's admissions with physical evidence. That meant that Albert was never actually charged with the Boston stranglings and never stood trial for them. Instead, he was tried only for rapes he committed as the Green Man. Of course, considering his confessions, most people, including journalists, considered the Strangler mystery solved.
To this day, everyone who read those papers believed that Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler.
Defending Albert on the Green Man charges, Bailey tried from the outset to convince the jury, all of whom had heard of Albert's confessions to the Boston stranglings, that Albert was insane.
I hope that they recognize insanity, because I think it will promote some interest in finding out why he is the way he is.
The prosecution said Albert knew right from wrong.
He would tie the women up. He would touch them on their breast, in their private parts. He was able to carry on a conversation. He was not ranting or raving or incomprehensible as he spoke to the many victims. We use that as a sign that he was sane and that he knew he was committing criminal acts.
The trial lasted 8 days. The jury took 4 hours to reach its verdict, guilty, but not insane.
I felt that we had given them a common sense, logical case, and I am pleased that they saw it our way, sir.
Albert was convicted on all charges. The judge sentenced DeSalvo to life in prison. Albert DeSalvo had never been formally charged with killing any of the victims of the Boston Strangler. Technically, all the cases remained open. But as far as a relieved nation was concerned, the Boston Strangler was at last behind bars. But Albert had other plans. Convicted of a series of rapes, Albert DeSalvo had been sentenced to life in prison. He had confessed to being the Boston Strangler, but would never stand trial for those crimes. In January 1967, he was returned to the mental hospital, awaiting transport to prison. A month later, he connived with 2 other patients to break out.
Insofar as we know, one of them, at least, must have had either a key or some type of metal artifact, whereby he was able to put his arm out of what is known as the peephole in the door.
The 3 escapees jumped down an elevator shaft under construction and scaled a brick wall. In Boston, they split up. Midnight, February 23rd, 1967. Albert DeSalvo was on the loose. Once again, fear gripped Boston.
It was a repetition of what they had gone through when he was running around loose killing people. Believe me when I tell you, the population of Greater Boston is 2 million. Let's say 1 million were women. 1 million women were in panic in Greater Boston at that time.
One newspaper offered a $5,000 reward for Albert's capture. DeSalvo's lawyer, F. Lee Bailey, said he would double that amount if Albert was captured unharmed. Police, heavily armed and carrying tear gas guns, combed the state.
The hysteria was incredible. It was front-page headlines in all of the newspapers. Newspaper articles appeared warning women what to do and what not to do.
Albert, meanwhile, decided to pay a visit to his younger brother.
I was kind of happy to hear his voice calling me from downstairs, rang the bell and says, "Hey, it's your brother Al down here," but surprised at the same time because, you know, even though I knew at some point he would escape, I just didn't know when.
Richard agreed to help Albert. He gave him civilian clothes and a gun. Now, armed and dangerous, Albert made it out of Boston and headed north to the city of Lynn, where police were on the alert.
The captain grabbed me and he says, "We have information that DeSalvo's in Lynn." And I said, "Oh, wonderful, that's all we need today."
It was 36 hours after Albert had escaped. After walking around undetected for a few hours, dressed in an old Navy uniform he had found, Albert stopped at a shoe store and asked to use the phone. He said he needed, quote, to call F. Lee.
And as soon as he said that, we all turned and realized that that was DeSalvo. And while he was calling Bailey, we called the Lynn police and told him he's here. While we were waiting for the police, I don't know why, but I
asked him, did you strangle all those 13 women? And he